Hi everybody, this is Solomon Schmidt from History Bites. I'm honored to be here today at the Holocaust Center for Humanity with Holocaust survivor Aggie Day from Hungary. Miss Day and her family were part of a small percentage of Hungarian Jewish people who escaped being captured by the Nazis and then sent to the Auschwitz Concentration Camp where they were killed. Since moving to the United States, Miss Day has spent a lot of time educating young people about her experiences during the Holocaust and that horrible time in history. Miss Day, thank you very much for coming on the History Bites YouTube channel. So, Miss Day, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, which is now Belgrade, Serbia, and May 13th, 1940.
And what was your birth name? Because I know it wasn't Aggie.
Oh dear, do we have to say that? It's actually a Serbian name, and it's Zagorka.
Zagorka.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I never know exactly. I don't know if it's Zagorka or Zagorka. I think it may be Zagorka, but anyway. Yeah.
And so how did you get the name Aggie?
Actually, that was my sister. I had a sister who was 12 and a half years older than me. And she used to take me in the carriage, and she used to walk by. And apparently, it was the custom when somebody saw a cute little baby. That was funny. When they saw a cute little baby, they'd put some money underneath the pillow underneath the baby.
Okay.
Anyway, so
parents like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure. No, probably not. But that was just anyway. And then my sister started calling me Zagi for short abbreviation. And from Zagi, it turned to Agi.
Okay.
And my mother and my sister were Hungarian. My father was not. And so, of course, they spoke Hungarian. And Agi is a very prominent, a common name in Hungary. I know it originally stems from Agnes, but that was not the case for me. It was just from a nickname. And Zagi became Agi, and I've been Agi ever since, and that's how it's pronounced in Hungarian, Agi. And of course here it's pronounced Aggie.
So you were born in Yugoslavia, and what language were you taught to speak? What was the first
Hungarian.
language?
We escaped when I was a little more than a year old.
Right, okay.
And so only Hungarian. I never spoke Serbian. Of course the rest of my father of course did, and my mother had learned some Serbian, and I guess my sister also. But we didn't live there that long. They didn't live there that long, so.
And can you tell us a little bit about your family, about your father, Leopold, your mother Esther, and your older sister Veronica?
Well, basically my father, unfortunately, can tell you nothing about his history or his background. At one point, I remember, apparently he went to school in Vienna to study medicine, which is what his father wanted him to do, but his father passed away, and as soon as he did, he stopped studying medicine. Basically, he was a businessman. And that's about all I can tell you. My mother was married previously and had my sister, so my sister was my half-sister. And so this was her second marriage to my father. And they got married apparently in 1938, so not long before I was born. And so my mother was Hungarian background for many generations, and she had two brothers. One was 2 years older than she, and one was 10 years older. And she lost her father when she was 10 years old. My grandfather passed away. And so actually apparently my older uncle, whom I never knew because he died during World War II, he sort of became sort of the man of the house and took care of everybody. But my grandmother took over the family businesses, which was a shoe factory.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what were some of the traits you remember about your mother, about her personality, her characteristics? What are some abiding memories you have?
Well, first of all, she was a very, very strong person, very, very strong person. She loved people, and people loved her. She was very social. Okay. And basically, everyone she touched or she spoke to, people always loved her. And when she was older, I mean, I saw manifestations of that all the time. She was a person who was not only social but very helpful. in any way she could, always. During the 1956 revolution, when we were living in Toronto, for about a year, basically it was like an in and out, because people just stayed with us, people that were friends of friends. They had escaped from Hungary, and I remember just people living at our house. Oh yeah, the house is open for anybody. And my friends loved her when I was growing up because she was just, she actually sounded very much like Zsa Gabor, which I know you're too young to remember who that is, but she was a famous actress, and she was Hungarian. And so my mother had the same kind of actor and the same accent, but my mother, so Zsa Gabor used to say darling all the time, and actually my mother said that all the time, and everybody just loved her. But she was very strong, and it was because of her that we survived, because she made decisions and her actions of what the things she arranged, and subsequently, like for example, when we escaped Hungary to communism. So very, very determined person, and I don't know, for example, when the Yugoslavs surrendered to the Nazis, when the Nazis came in and we were living in Belgrade, we had some soldiers came, some actually officers came and told my family to get out. Now I was a year old at that time. And my mother convinced these officers to let my father, my sister, and me and her to be in the maid's room, and she would cook and clean our place, her place, and let us stay there. Because otherwise, otherwise
the
they would
Gestapo?
have, pardon?
For the Gestapo, you mean?
Well, I don't know if they were Gestapo or officers,
Okay.
whoever they were, they just came and took over. And they did that on numerous occasions. They came into a Jewish household and said, get out. You have 20 minutes to get out of your home, which to me is incredible. And but that's what they did. And most people would just pack some bags and leave. And so my mother managed to, she was very charming, she was beautiful, and she was a very charming person, and she charmed people, she really did. Just the way she was, the way she acted, she just like, that was one of her traits. So she convinced them that she would clean and cook, and she did. And that way, we weren't out on the street. And to me, that's incredible, because I can't imagine somebody coming into your home, my home, and your things, and we all value our homes, and to have strangers take over and for you to cook and clean for these, that to me is not only courageous, but very smart, because this is the way
Exactly.
Very smart, very ingenious, I think, and
So were you raised in the Jewish religion, or were you ethnically Jewish, or both?
Nothing. I was not raised, I knew nothing about being Jewish till I came to Canada when I was 11. And then my mother started making sure that we would be in an area and be a place where there were Jewish people, and introduced me to that. So that became very important to me. But until I was 11, I knew nothing about being Jewish. No.
But were any of your ancestors ethnically Jewish?
Well, everybody was Jewish.
Right.
Oh yeah. No, I come from a, I think I was, you know, that, what is it, 1, 2, 3 or whatever, you know, when they take the ancestry, like 99.3% Ashkenazi
Okay.
Jewish, meaning the Ashkenazi Jewish, meaning Eastern European, as opposed to Sephardic Jewish. But yeah, very much Jewish on both sides.
Okay. And so you mentioned the Nazis taking over Yugoslavia. They were forcing Jewish people to leave their houses. Your mother managed to help you to be able to stay in your house by cooking and cleaning for the Nazis. So when and why did you and your family leave Yugoslavia?
Well, I mean, they started deporting people from Yugoslavia, the Jews, right away, or very quickly after the Nazis came in.
To concentration camps?
Yeah. And then, so, I mean, the writing was on the wall. This was temporary while my parents were trying to figure out what to do. I mean, they knew this wasn't sustainable. They weren't going to stay there. But my mother's mother, my grandmother, lived in Budapest, and they were communicating, and apparently that was not taking the place. They were not deporting Jewish Hungarians. So they were deporting Jews who were not Hungarian, but not Hungarian Jews,
Okay.
because of Miklos Horthy, who was
The leader of Hungary.
yeah.
Right.
So he because of him. So my mother was making plans to escape from Belgrade because it was only a matter of time.
Right, before.
And there wasn't much time. So I don't know exactly how long that took. They tried to get out of Hungary, and then eventually they found that the only way to leave was to just start marching and walking.
And you were what, 2 years old at the time?
No, I wasn't 2 years old. I was over a year, but
Okay.
not sure exactly.
You were born in 1940,
I
right?
was born in 1940. This is like about 1941.
So even though you don't have specific memories from it, do you remember anything your family told you about that walk from Yugoslavia to Budapest?
A few things, just a few things. One, my sister was 13 at the time. Actually, people had abandoned stores, so people were just marching, just trying in any way to escape. So the distance between Budapest and Belgrade is about 196 miles. Most of that was walking. I'm sure they did get some lifts, I think in trucks.
Right.
But when my mother made arrangements to escape from Belgrade, my parents, they tried every which way, renting a bus, whatever, getting a car. It just was not possible because they were just very contained. And then my sister, I remember the story about my sister finding a candy store that all the stores had been abandoned, all
Right.
kinds of stores, whether it was clothing or jewelry, and those things were not important. But she found a candy store, and so she put a lot of candy in my carriage, which they had for me, and at least that was food, and that was one of the things. The other thing that my mother told me was near the border of Hungary and Yugoslavia, there was a small town, and they took respite there for a few days. It was a Jewish town. In those days, they had a lot of Jewish villages with a lot of Jews, and they were villages in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Russia. And they had starting in the 1800s, they had what was called pogroms, which
Okay.
when the Jews were gathered and they were beaten. It was a bad thing, but that's how a lot of villages were, where we were stopped in one of the villages and we were given respite for a few days. And then my mother said, all of a sudden she woke up and she said, we have to leave right away. And she had like not a dream, just a feeling.
Just a feeling. Right.
And the rabbi of the town said, oh, please stay, you're welcome to live here, stay here. Well, of course, that would never have been a thing, but still, my mother said, no, we have to leave right away. And they did. And then it turns out a few days later she found out, I guess by word of mouth, that that whole village had been annihilated. So it was interesting because there were a couple of incidences that I don't believe in ESP, and yet I do, because that certainly was an example of it. Just a feeling. But sometimes we have feelings which have happened to me that don't come true.
Right.
So it's just an interesting phenomenon.
So when you arrived in Hungary, why did your father have to go into hiding by himself?
Because he was Serbian. He was Serbian.
Right, not Hungarian, Jewish.
Not
so
Hungarian.
not
And the only
protected.
reason he went, he didn't go to hiding right away.
Okay.
We lived with my grandmother. But then one of the neighbors actually informed on my father. They knew that he was not Jewish. Not Jewish, sorry, that he was not Hungarian. And so then they informed to the Gestapo, and my parents were called to the Gestapo. And my father immediately went into hiding, into the countryside somewhere, I don't know where.
And what was your first memory of him at the age of 2?
At the age of 2, yeah. Basically saying goodbye to him and crying at the door when he left.
So did you live in relative safety in Hungary during the 2 years before the Nazis occupied the country?
Apparently so.
Okay.
And I've even got some pictures, I think, I don't think they're after the war. Maybe they are. I'm not sure. But yeah, and I have no memory. I have no memory of that at all until I was 4 years old. So, you know, but most children don't. I think most children don't have a memory between time of 2 and 4,
Right.
unless it's traumatic. And that, I think, basically why I do have so many memories is because they were traumatic. But a regular before that, no.
So in 1944, the Nazis took over Hungary and began deporting hundreds of thousands of Jewish people to Auschwitz Concentration Camp, where they were put to death in gas chambers. After the war, Nazi guards at Auschwitz revealed that there were so many dead bodies of Hungarian Jewish people that the crematoriums at Auschwitz could not keep up with the demand to burn all of them. So, Ms. Day, how did you and your family survive during that time when the Nazis took over the country and began deporting Jewish people?
We went into hiding, and my mother had heard about a priest who was saving some Jewish women, and she approached him and to save us, and he just had to refuse because he just said he couldn't. He had already hidden so many people. But my mother, as I said, she was a very strong character, very strong character, and very courageous, and relentless, and she would not give up. This was because she didn't know where to hide, but we did hide, I think, in a hospital. That I do have a memory of that, being in a hospital, just because it was very traumatic. We hid with. I was actually in a crib in a children's ward, and that I have a memory of. And then, in fact, somebody very close to me, my sister's father. So he was like my uncle. So he was part of the family. You know, my mother's first husband, and I called him uncle, and he was in hiding with us at that time, and unfortunately he didn't make it. My mother kept on and on with the priest till finally he relented, and he said, "Okay, you'll come into my apartment." He lived in an apartment, and we moved in. My mother, my sister, my grandmother, and I, and he lived alone, and so we could only walk one person at a time. We could only speak in whispers because nobody was to know that he was hiding us. Had it been known, he would have been killed. That would have been the end. Now, at that time already, Budapest was an actually enemy of the Allies. So Budapest was being bombed.
Okay.
And the apartment buildings all had a system because, number one, all these apartments, if you've ever been to Europe, now I don't know what happened to them, I'm sure they're still there, they have these cellars.
Right.
And they also have the courtyards. Most of them have courtyards, and they're sort of in a square. And so every time there was an air raid, they had all these arrangements that everybody that lived in an apartment had to come down into the cellar. And they had sort of a system whereby to make sure everybody was safe and not staying in their apartment during the air raid, but they were safe in the cellars. So every time there was an air raid, of course, and bombings, there was a warning to let people know that they were going to be bombed, and people went into the cellars, and of course the priests had to go. And we were persona non grata. We weren't supposed to be there, of course. So we hid in the bathroom, which had no windows. That was sort of the safest place to be. And sometimes we were there for hours. And what I remember is my mother made like a bed in the bathtub for my grandmother because, she was old. Right. And so that was a place to rest. Otherwise, we were in this tiny little bathroom. It was pretty scary. I do remember one time actually, one of the windows were shattered in the apartment, and we heard all the bombings and all the crashes. It was very loud.
The sirens?
Well, the sirens were before. That was before.
Right.
That was very scary. In fact, that remained sort of every time I heard sirens after that, for many, many years, I became scared. And then after a few weeks, I believe 6 weeks, I'm not sure, the priest found a place for my sister and my mother and my grandmother in a convent.
Okay.
And they dressed as nuns, and there were about 40 other Jewish women. They were all dressed as nuns. And every now and then the Gestapo would come to investigate, just really just to look and see what was going on. I mean, there was no freedom, but they were all dressed as nuns. My sister was dressed really like a novitiate because she was only, I think, 17 at the time. And I was put with a couple from the priest's, congregation and so on.
Yep.
And I was told a different name, and I was told that I was to say that I was a cousin of theirs from the countryside, and I just was with them. So basically, I was separated from my mother and my grandmother and my sister. It was pretty scary and they also told me not to talk to anybody when we went into the cellars, because of course, every time there was an air raid, we went into the cellars with everyone else.
I'm sure they were afraid that you might reveal something after
course,
a while?
Of course. I mean, here they were trusting a 4-year-old to say that I was their cousin. I knew I wasn't their cousin, to give me another name, which was not my name.
Right.
And, but, when I do talk to a lot of students, and I do tell them, when a child of war is told to do something, and I think this is very universal, not just me, basically, we just did what we were told. You didn't ask, why am I doing this, and why do I have to do this? You're told to be quiet, you're quiet. You're told to be given, this is your name, and you didn't question. Because we were aware, I mean, I was aware, and I know children of war are, they're very aware of of fear, of things that are going on. So very different than how you were brought up, how I brought up my children, my grandchildren were brought up. Very, very different. They ask why. You always ask why. I'm sure you grew up asking why all the time. That does not happen. Does not happen. So this couple decided the couple I was with, decided they wanted to leave Budapest because there was more food in the countryside. And so they told me they were leaving, and they took me to the train station with them. And what I remember is standing at the train station with them, being absolutely terrified. I was going to be going to the country, and I was never going to see my mother again. And that fear is something that I will always remember. And all of a sudden, it was to me like a little miracle, like a big miracle. All of a sudden, the priest and my mother came. They were coming to get me. And there they were. But before that, here I was terrified. And they came to get me. But basically came to get me and immediately took me to another couple, where we went through the whole routine again. I was given a name, a different name, this country, and don't talk to the people, etc.
Speak when spoken to.
But you cannot imagine how excited I was. And it was interesting because sometime in my 40s, whenever my mother and I were talking, and we were talking about this incident, and I was telling her about it, and my mother very casually said to me, oh yeah, it was of course all arranged, and they knew that they were going to the train station, and they were going to come and get me. And I remember being very, very upset and really angry because nobody had told me that. And I did not know that it was arranged till I was in my 40s. So I think that was like a huge shock to me. And, but again, an example of how nothing was told to a child in terms of explanations or anything like that. And then also in those days, aside from being a child of war, because I think children of war very much have the same experience today in different countries that are war-torn. But in my day, when we were brought up, again, we really had to obey, and things were much stricter, and we didn't ask why. And so I find that interesting.
Can you tell us about your uncle Alador?
Aladar.
And
Aladar.
what happened to him?
Well, he survived, but but in Hungary, before the deportation started, during the time when there were Jewish people were not deported, before the hiding, before that. So what they did with young Hungarian men is they worked in work camps. They put them in work camps. And they were starved and beaten. It was very, very bad situations. And that's where my uncle was, because he was a young man. Now, my uncle, the older uncle, got typhus, and he died before that. So I think he died around 1940, so sort of at the 41, at the beginning of the war. So he was not, he was not alive. But my uncle was in a work camp until later on, where a superior of his, when they started deporting the Hungarians, and they were going to deport all these young men in the work camps, well, he was very well liked. He was also, like my mother, very well liked. He was a very funny guy, and so his superior, who of course was not Jewish and so on, and when they found out that they were going to deport the Hungarians, he told them to go AWOL, and he escaped, and he went into hiding. So he was basically saved by the superior, and that's what happened to him, and he survived the war. And after the war, after many years, we saw him quite often. He came to visit us in Canada. My mother brought him over, and when we went to Hungary,
But by his superior, you mean the Nazi who oversaw his camp?
Yeah,
right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think it was in May of 1945, the Russians took over Hungary from the Nazis, and I know a lot of people.
Well, the Allies, all of the Allies.
Right.
The Russians were just the army that came in. But
who came into Budapest.
Yeah.
And so did the people look at it like other countries did as a liberation because they were being freed from the Nazis, or was it one of suspicion because these were communists coming in to take over the government?
Exactly. Yes, they were happy the war was over. There were no more bombing, of course. Yes, they were very unhappy. What I do remember is when that happened, I was still with the couple, and the Russian army, there were soldiers that were marching into the city, and people were turned out. And I remember, I knew I wasn't very excited because I was so, you're going to see your mother, be with your mother again. But the people around me were quiet, and even, it's funny, as a 5-year-old, I felt, why weren't they excited like I was? I was very excited. And they were all standing around and very quiet. Well, of course, now, of course, I know that. Why? There were, first of all, the Russians were an enemy of Hungary because Hungary had invaded Russia in 1941, I believe. So they were enemies anyway. Yeah. Right. So and plus they were communists, and people did not want
one
to be
tyranny for another.
Exactly, in a different way. And so no, they were not happy for that, and so that.
So you and your family had to flee again, right?
Well,
to another country?
But there were a lot of before that, yes, eventually, yes. My father, of course, had been in hiding, and my mother sent us to him for a while because there was food in the countryside.
Okay.
And actually, he was with Russian soldiers, and it was sort of and then we left and went back to Budapest. He escaped. I think he was helped to escape to Austria. And we were waiting for him to get us out and properly but he wasn't able to do it fast enough for my mother. And slowly the government, the communists took over the government. Not right, slowly. And people were becoming more and more contained. They weren't able to leave. My mother finally saw the writing on the wall. We were trying to get out legally. We couldn't do it, and my mother arranged for another escape. And we escaped via boat during the night on the border. On the border of Hungary and Austria, there's a lake. And we traveled through the lake in a huge rowboat during the midnight, and by that time, of course, I was 6. And so I knew we'd be shot if we were caught. That was pretty scary, and it took all night. And every time we heard a noise, we went through the bulrushes and so on, and every time there was a noise, we'd go into the bulrushes. But we managed to escape, and then on the other side, it was all arranged. We were taken to a DP camp, which is a deportation camp for immigrants, for refugees really. And that's where I first went to school.
And so was Austria a safe place for Jewish people to go, or just those camps where you were at?
No, Austria was actually safe, because Austria was being run at that time by the 4 Allies.
Okay.
So it was a free country, and it was run by actually the Russians, France, Britain, and the United States. It was occupied by the 4 Allies, and that was for quite a long time. And the deportation camps, the DP camps, were a place for what were they going to do with all, just like
right.
they have other camps today. So,
right.
yeah, and I had to learn German, and because I only spoke Hungarian. I went to school there for the first time. And yeah, and but then my father was living in Vienna, and he had established a business there. And so even though we had to be in the DP camp, he was not. So we would see each other.
Okay.
He would come and visit, or we'd visit him in Vienna.
And was there prejudice against the Jewish people?
No idea.
In Austria?
No idea. I did not. I'm sure there. I don't know. I personally did not experience anything
okay.
like that. But I'm sure there was, because the Austrians also have been very anti-Semitic.
Do you have a memory of ever being mocked or mistreated for being Jewish?
Oh, sure, in Canada.
Okay. And so, how did you come to live in Canada?
Well, it was through, again, the refugee organization, Jewish organization, which had arranged. And how we came to live in Canada is Toronto, which has a big population of Canadian Jews,
yes.
very wealthy, community, and they, through this Jewish organization, help financially to guarantee to bring over immigrants. And so it was arranged that my mother would come over as a housekeeper, and to work with this Jewish family for a year, for sure. And then whatever time, when she could, then she'd get a job, which eventually is what she did. But she could not bring me, because I would have been a burden on her, and I couldn't be in the house with as a housekeeper.
Right.
Okay. When my mother worked as a housekeeper. So I went to live with my father in Vienna, while my mother was a housekeeper for a year, and then she got a job, and when she was able to show that she could support me, then I went to live with I went to Canada. But in the meantime, I lived with my father, and I have wonderful memories of that, because he did very well, and financially, and when I was introduced to theater and opera and things like that, and every Saturday we'd go somewhere. So I have very fond memories, but that's when I really got to know my father, and that was hard on me too, because then I had to leave my father, because I always knew it would be eventually going with my mother.
Okay.
And my parents did get divorced, because they really hadn't spent any time. They really weren't together very long, and never really during the war and so on.
Right.
And so then I went to live with my mother.
Did you ever see your father again?
Actually, no, because he passed away when I was 16, and so I went to Canada. I was 11, and when I was 16, he passed away. He became sick when I was about 14, and we, of course, a lot of communication back and forth, and we had planned that I would go back to visit him, but unfortunately, because he got sick, that never happened. And my going to Canada took sort of a long time because I had to leave my father January, and I left school then at that time too. And that voyage took about 5 months because the only way that I could come was through the red tape of immigration. And my father could have sent me privately, but Canada wouldn't accept that. And because of the rules, I was a refugee, an immigrant, and I had to travel to Germany where the boat would get us. And that took about 5 months, so I spent time in orphanages traveling along that voyage. So that was not a very good memory, which was just the way it was, red tape.
Right. So when you moved to Canada, you were 11, that would be 1951.
51.
So what career did you pursue when you got older?
From 1951 on, well, eventually I became a teacher.
Right.
Yeah, I became a teacher and I taught in Toronto. And so that was my career. And then we moved to Montreal.
So why do you think it is important for children to learn history, especially the history of the Holocaust?
Well, I think it's part of history, and history is very important to learn, because when we look at history, we know where we came from. We know how things were different or how things were the same, and based upon history is who we are today. And the history forms us and decides who we are, how we should behave. And hopefully from history and from the Holocaust, hopefully people learn not to repeat the mistakes that people
Right.
made during bad times. And there are many, many other times in history that things were not good. And of course the Holocaust is one of the horrible things, because 12 million people really were killed for no reason but 6 million Jews, 6 million others just because they weren't the same as other people. And hopefully we learn from the Holocaust not to repeat those mistakes again. That's very important.
What are you most thankful for in your life? If you can think of one thing that stands out to you more than anything else.
Well, I'm not really sure how to answer that. I am thankful for, obviously, I guess the main thing is, I mean, when I think of my history, is my mother, really. My mother's strength and how she got us, well, how I'm here because of her.
Right.
I'm here because of her actions, because of her decisions. And so I guess to me, I guess that would be what I'm thankful for, having a mother like I had. Yeah. And even, I mean, after the war, the kind of mother she was, the kind of grandmother she was to my children. My grandchildren who didn't know my mother, we talk about Grandma Esther, because she was, like I said, a very loving person. And even after we moved to Seattle, my mother would come very often and stay with us. And my children, I was lucky, a lot of Holocaust survivors can't talk about their experiences, and my mother was very open and did to my children. And so my children talk about Grandma Esther, and we've talked about Grandma Esther to their children, my grandchildren, so they feel like they know my mother. So I guess my mother was a very, very important person in our family.
And can you explain the significance of some of the jewelry you're wearing?
Well, just this ring and this bracelet were my mother's, and there were about maybe 3, 4 other pieces of jewelry that remained by her hiding them, by sewing them into clothing, because otherwise she couldn't, they couldn't take anything out.
When you fled from country to country?
When we fled. And that during bad times, during war times, I've spoken to a lot of people. I remember another couple, and again, if you want to take anything, people did that. People sewed things into to try and something that was dear to them. And so So this ring for my mother meant a lot, because she and her best friend had made this ring, ring made in the 1930s in Budapest, and she took that with, she wanted to take that with her. So that was just, I think a lot of people tried to do that, and if they were caught, of course, not only was that taken, but they were killed. But people do that, and I know other people have done that.
So what do you think are some ways people can honor the Jewish people who suffered and died during the Holocaust?
Well, I think one of the things, for example, that I do is I talk to classes and people and other audiences, even in university classes, and to just keep memory alive of, again, history, memory alive of what happened, and to learn from it and not to repeat those mistakes. I think if people honor that and remember that and become better people for it by not repeating those mistakes, that to me is what you have to do to keep that alive and to let people know the truth and to know what happened and just to learn from it. That to me is the way of honoring the past and honoring those who were victims of the Holocaust.
All right, everybody, thank you very much for watching the interview, and thank you again to Ms. Day for coming on the History Bites YouTube channel. Please give this video a thumbs up and click that subscribe button and share the video with all of your friends. And until next time, everybody, go learn your history.